Today, many institutions of learning had closed their doors in tribute to the memory of Martin Luther King. So had the YMHA. I think it is fitting not to begin this lecture without speaking of him for a moment. Speaking of a man who has been killed because he represented the best that man has: love, courage, and hope. We have heard many words these days about him, some of them undoubtedly sincere, some of them trying to buy off action by words and all sorts of other gestures. But we know that words, even when they are sincere, especially in these days, very often are substitutes for genuine experience. And it seems to me there are only two ways to express the reaction to the murder of this man. One is action, and nothing could correspond to the words which have been uttered than an action radical enough that it requires the ending of the Vietnam War in a very short time. And the others would be expressions of poetry or music. And I think, since we do not, or I do not have these at my disposal, the best way to express our feelings are silence. Those of you who share this view of mine are asked to rise for 1 minute silence. It may be fitting to make the transition between the expression of our reaction to the events of these days by talking about a theoretical problem which I would have come to talk about probably anyway in the course of these lectures, but which I think I might talk directly about now before resuming the regular plan of these lectures. And that is the problem of understanding violence, of not hating in response to violence, which is so much talked about these days, when in fact, of course, the main violence came from the man who murdered King, and from those, which may not be so few, who did not have the regret most Americans seem to have, and not from the reactive hostility which this murder arose in the poorest part of our population. But I want to suggest to you that here's a real problem, a real psychological problem of understanding perhaps I could be quite concrete by introducing the following thought which you often hear. Sometimes is expressed in the French saying, "Tout comprendre, c'est tout pardonner." To understand everything means to forgive everything. If one understands evil and violence of this type which killed King, certainly is evil, it is the utmost of evil, that then indeed one can forgive. What does that mean? I'm sure many of you have heard, like I did in various statements about the murderer, of whom so far it is said one has the name, that he was a lunatic, that he was crazy. Well, I don't know how one knows that if one doesn't know who he is. But at any rate, let us assume he was crazy. So do we say then, because he was crazy, his act was not real? His act was an accident? In the first place, we know, and it has happened in the last 50 years, that a number of crazy people have committed precisely the acts which were in the political interests of a number of people who were by no means crazy. And that these people have created an atmosphere in which the crazy man pulls the trigger, even if you cannot demonstrate that he got instructions from anyone who had an interest in his pulling the trigger. To understand evil, to understand violence, means really to put oneself into the other person and to discover in oneself that nothing human is alien to one, that some of the same evilness is in all of us. And if one can fully put oneself into the other person, then indeed one does not hate. Then indeed one can fulfill the command of the New Testament, love thy enemy, because there is no more enemy, because I and he are one, because I am one with all of humanity. But very often, and this is what I'm talking about, this understanding leads to unrealism and sentimentality. This understanding then means, well, then nothing is so bad, nothing is so evil. One doesn't need to be so much concerned with it because it's just crazy, it's just sick. And I'm trying to say that one should distinguish these two things completely. One is understanding, not only in the superficial psychological sense that one understands why a man did something. That's very little. Not talking about him, but in the deep human understanding of putting oneself into him and then ceasing to hate. But at the same time to be cynically realistic about what he did and why he did it, and what is the political function of what he did, and what are the consequences of his deed, and not to take a sentimental role that because this is all sick, this is all pathological, this is unconscious, and God knows what, we can shut our eyes to the very nature of the evil which is done. I don't know whether I can make myself quite clear enough in these few minutes about the paradox between not hating, not judging, and understanding on the one hand, and at the same time being utterly realistic and unsentimental. I would like to make it clear to you that I believe that the great insight, which not only exists since Freud, which exists since the Old Testament, or which exists since Balzac or Dostoevsky or Shakespeare, it doesn't matter. That all these insights into the nature of another man, which is in the last analysis an insight into ourselves, is one thing quite separate from unsentimental appreciation of the facts. The facts are not more rosy, are not less ominous, are not less dangerous, because I can put myself, because I do not hate, because I can put myself in the other person. If I may use a very trivial example, if I see a very bad painting, and somebody says to me, but the painter tried hard, and he was poor, and he had no time to study, then I can feel a deep sympathy with a painter. But if I start to say painting is good because he suffered so much, then I'm a sentimental fool. This is only a very innocent example. And I suggest that if we want to follow non-hating and not violence, we should not fall into complacency of sugarcoating facts and should combine the most difficult of two qualities to be combined, namely that of ruthless realism in seeing facts and deep humanity in understanding and not hating. This topic, I think, will remain important in the discussions which will arise from now on and perhaps increasingly. And if one is afraid that this destruction of men who present the best in humanity may not even stop with the death of Martin Luther King, then indeed one should be prepared for utter realism and at the same time for a deep human understanding which makes hate impossible. However, one has to be able to afford it. There was a great man in this city, known over the world, although by far not as known as Martin Luther King. That was I.J. Muste, of whom I'm sure some of you knew, who said, "If I cannot love Hitler, I love nobody." This was not a phrase. This was as real and as authentic as any statement could be. But there are very few people who can afford to make that statement. Only a very great man, a man of the depths of love and humanity as Muste, could make it legitimately. Those who make it and who have not reached the depth of understanding and humanity will easily make that statement and blur the facts and be prone to think that the evil of Hitler was after all not so evil. There was no man more aware of the evilness of Hitler than Muste, and yet he, but not everybody, could truthfully say that he loved him. Well, after these remarks, I might as well come back to where we were, because otherwise this plan of lecture gets too much out of order. I shall talk briefly about the conflict which Freud was in. I mentioned it last time, when he tried to mitigate the harshness of his tragic alternative that man can either destroy himself or destroy others. He made several suggestions. One was that the superego could be charged with aggression, which otherwise would be directed towards others. But that is really no good answer, because if the superego is charged with that amount of aggression, which is biologically given in the death instinct, then indeed you would have a population with so guilt-ridden, with such a pathological, self-destructive attitude of self-accusation that even a Victorian moralist would be abhorred by the horror of this self-accusation and of this guilt. Another way something else he was suggesting is perhaps sounds more plausible, although it really, in my opinion, is not. And that was that the death instinct, in his opinion, could be tamed. to culturally valuable objects. He says here, I just quote one sentence, "The instinct of destruction, moderated and tamed, and as it were inhibited in its aim, must, when it is directed towards objects, provide the ego with the satisfaction of its vital needs and with control over nature." Now, that sounds good, but actually if you ask yourself, what is control over nature? Control over nature is construction, is agriculture, is building houses, is producing things. Nature is not controlled except by the, I was going to say except by nuclear weapons, but that's not a control of nature, but a destruction of nature. But otherwise, a control of nature in the process of civilization is a process of construction. And therefore, it is in a way play with words, or a very little tenable idea to say that destructiveness is transformed into control of nature, because destructiveness, the death instinct, wishes to undo life, and the control of nature, which is part of the process of life, wants to enhance life, to do something for life. Another way out of which Freud suggested was something which psychologists sometimes call redirection of aggressiveness, change of object. That is also not very promising, because if that drive for destruction, which is anchored in the very biological nature of man, is directed toward whom is it changed? Into sports? Well, we have not seen that the Olympic Games have greatly contributed to the lowering of aggression in the world. In spite of the Olympic Games, aggression has increased and violence has increased tremendously in the last 30 years. Now, then Freud has another idea, which is a much more appealing idea in my own way of thinking, and that is that aggression, the death instinct, could be curbed or could be diminished by bringing in eros. He says here that anything that encourages the growth of emotional ties between men must operate against war. Indeed, but then this is not consistent with his basic premise, because if all nature, all living substance is characterized by the presence of an instinct for destruction, then and the eros is present at the other pole anyway, how can this instinct for destruction be done away with by that eros, which anyway is a one polarity, the one pole is against the death instinct? Where does that death instinct go? And the same answer holds true for something else which is most interesting in Freud's construction, and that is something which he talks not very much about, but it's very, very significant, and that is the idea that there is something like an organic repression of instincts. Perhaps I could read you just quickly one statement here where he says, in the end of the letter to Einstein, he speaks of the process of civilization as a factor leading to a lasting, as it were, constitutional, in quotes, organic repression of instincts. Now, what Freud is saying here is really a most significant statement, namely that in the process of civilization, the basic nature of man changes, that the instincts, if you please, dry out. They don't disappear completely, but they dry out, they become less strong. Aggressiveness becomes less violent, because that's really what is meant by organic repression, a formula in which he tries to keep to the word repression, which, however, really systematically doesn't make much sense here. It means that the drying off of aggressive instincts. But again, I'm afraid the same criticism must be leveled against this theory, because if all living substance is determined by these two forces, the force for life and the force for striving for death, how can this one pole be slowly drying up? How can it be diminished? What happens to the other, to the life instinct? What happens to the organic nature, which Freud assumed to be the essence of the death instinct? If you would say that in terms of the older instinct theory, the one which most psychoanalysts have later on accepted, namely of a destructive instinct, then it would be much more plausible. But for the death instinct as being rooted in the very nature of living substance, it is very difficult to imagine how this force, how this power inherent in all life could be, in the process of civilization, be what he calls organically repressed. Now, naturally, I'm not trying here to cover this problem in any systematic form. This is a very complex problem. I mention it only because it's there, and those who are interested can read Freud and can think about it more. I'm now speaking about all the factors, and I try to be very brief, which make it appear that the theory, the hydraulic theory of Freud, and as I said, this is also basically the theory of Lawrence, why this theory does not really hold water. The first reason is, of course, and this has been pointed out by many psychoanalysts, that the whole construction of the death instinct in Freud is based on very, one has to say, flimsy evidence, like the compulsion to repeat and things like that, which clinically, empirically, really are very unconvincing. But I should like to mention the second element, or maybe I mentioned that a little later. I should like to mention first that also neurophysiological findings of the last years do not seem to, in any way, to confirm Freud's assumptions about, or for that matter, Lawrence's assumption about this hydraulically operative, destructive drive. It seems that the best neurophysiological theory would go in the direction of the assumption that there is an aggressive potential. I spoke about that in the first lecture, that there is an aggressive potential in the neurophysiological organization of man, but that this potential needs to be reactivated by definite stimuli, by definite signals, and is not something which increases as time goes on and has to explode quite regardless of stimuli or provocations. Now, if you take another field where we could learn something about the aggressive instinct in Freud's sense, we would turn to the animal kingdom. And I should like to present you with a very simple consideration. Freud says himself, and that's perfectly logical, the death instinct, of course, would not only apply to man, but to all animals, because it is something inherent in living substance. Therefore, we would have to find evidence in the animal kingdom that those animals who are particularly aggressive don't harm themselves, and those animals which are particularly peaceful die earlier or get more sick or show any sign of this alternative between aggression outside and aggression inside. Now, there is nothing of the kind to be observed in the animal kingdom of any such alternative. And I would say, while the human material might be, for many reasons, more complex and more open to discussion, the animal material would clearly show that this alternative aggression, either to the outside or to the inside, just is not an alternative which can be shown in the reaction of animals. But in general, it has to be said that among the primates and the mammals in general, acts of aggression against their own species, members of their own species, are relatively rare. In fact, it might be said that if man had only the aggressive potential of the primates, then indeed he would be a most peaceful being, and there would be very little bloodshed on this earth. Of course, this is a very extended field, and there is a great deal of literature about it. So let me just, to give you an example, quote a few statements from one of the best papers on this field by Hall in the very interesting book, Natural History of Aggression, a symposium on aggression, which, for those who are interested, is very valuable to read. He speaks there about observations among the baboons, which are among the more aggressive of the primate, and says, in all the species, intergroup spacing is achieved with the peculiar exception of the temple rhesus without fighting. The relationship between baboon groups are characterized by mutual tolerance or mutual avoidance according to the nature of their habitat. No aggressive interactions between groups have ever been recorded by Hall or DeVore in over 2,000 hours of observation. About the chimpanzees, the following statement: aggressive and submissive interactions between individuals were infrequent, and the concept of a dominance hierarchy amongst the animals cannot be substantiated even among the temporary groupings. In a very interesting book on mountain gorillas by Scholl, who observed them in their habitat and not in the zoo, he states that interaction between groups were usually entirely peaceable. Well, now Lawrence gives a lot of examples from the geese and from the fish. Now, I understand from geneticists that it is a most doubtful procedure to assume that man has inherited qualities of the grey-lag geese and of certain types of fish if these same qualities are not to be found in the primates nor in the mammals. It is for geneticists to decide that, but it does not seem to be an acceptable idea to most geneticists. So we come really to the result, and you would have to read a good deal more about this literature, that the animal kingdom is not one in which you find any great aggressiveness against members of their own species, not even very much against other species, that you find on the whole a peaceful attitude. You find some primates like the chimpanzees who get kind of easily angry, but usually nothing happens. No attack, no hurting, nothing. It's just a matter of, you might say, what we would call an angry temperament. And in fact, this holds true for a great deal of what had been described by some observers among fights between animals. Some observers have been impressed that certain animals make a lot of noise, like if a man yells and shouts and gets red in the face, and they assume this means they are very aggressive. Now, we know that quite a few people easily shout and get red in the face, but they are not aggressive. And others are very aggressive who don't get red in the face and don't shout. This is an entirely different problem. So altogether, I would say one has to come to the conclusion that the evidence for the inheritance of aggressiveness from the animal kingdom is negative. Now, let me say a few words about the anthropological material. Perhaps first one remark, and that is, you would expect that there are quite a number of books, or at least one book in anthropology, which would deal systematically with destructiveness and aggressiveness among animals. Because, after all, this is not a new problem. This is a very important human problem, and you would expect that anthropologists would have given enough attention to it to write several, or at least one, large systematic work about it. But there is nothing. There is practically, there are a number of papers which deal with this aspect or that aspect. There are a number of descriptions of various tribes in which you have a lot of description about their aggressiveness, their warfare. There is a book on war which takes on the whole problem of war among nations, among tribes, but the material on primitive societies, although very abundant, actually is rather meaningless because the categories are rather meaningless. But there is no thorough work where you could go and orient yourself to say, well, primitive society, in primitive societies, aggressiveness or destructiveness is such and such. You can make some generalizations. You are just lost there. Well, I can only report then about, and a good deal, for instance, there is one paper by Professor Freeman, which is written from a strictly dogmatic Freudian viewpoint, and it's a paper of about 15 pages in which he sees nothing but aggressiveness in humans, and in which he explains that as a natural consequence of the death instinct. I shall talk in a little while about the frequency of aggressiveness in human beings. I'm still talking about now among primitive societies. Perhaps I could mention two examples here. I recently used 28 tribes which are described in books by Murdoch, by Margaret Mead, and by Ruth Benedict in their description of various tribes, not from the standpoint of destructiveness or aggressiveness, but from other standpoints. And I made my own statistics, so to speak, about what is the incidence of destructiveness among these 28 tribes which are described there. And I found that if I follow the material as it is offered, you find three very distinct groups of or kinds of aggressiveness or non-aggressiveness. You find tribes, non-literate or primitive tribes, whatever you call them, which are exceedingly unaggressive, friendly, kind, human, and in which there is no place for war, in which there is no place for human aggression at all, or hardly any. This is one part. The other extreme, you find cultures which are cruel, sadistic, necrophilous, with marked cruelty, marked aggressiveness. And you find others where you find, you might say a little bit like our own, that they are basically not vicious, sadistic, but nevertheless also they do not have that disarming quality of peacefulness which some of the first group have, but they are perfectly willing to engage in war, but without the cruelty, the torture, and the hate and violence which you find typically in the second group I mentioned. And if you analyze if you take this little statistical survey, then you find that the first group, the peaceful group, comprises 9. The extremely vicious and cruel group comprises 11, and the in-between group comprises 8 of the 28 tribes which are to be found in the description of these 3 authors. That is, roughly speaking, 1/3 for each. I want to mention another statistical, another work on the same subject matter by an author, Stuart Palmer, Murder and Suicide in 40 Non-Literate Societies. He took very different societies from the ones I took, and he came to the conclusion that among these 40 societies, 13 were above the median score both for murder and suicide. This work was meant to examine the Freudian thesis that aggression went either against oneself or against others, so that you would have to find empirically that if you have much aggression against others, you have little aggression against oneself, and vice versa. Now he found that in 13 there was a higher aggression both for murder and suicide, while in 14 others there was low aggression both in murder and suicide, and only in the rest was such that the combined that there was a difference between murder and suicide. Now I found something very dissimilar in a statistic which I took from the World Health Organization data, which are published in the Sane Society. And that is, you have there the data for suicide and homicide separated. Now, it is true that in general, in countries where you have much homicide, you have little suicide. And in countries where you have much suicide, you have little homicide. But you have to consider that this goes together with another fact. You have the industrialized country with little homicide and with a good deal of suicide, and the poor countries with little suicide and much homicide. Now, there are some reasons which I cannot enter into here for the fact that industrialized countries you have little homicide, while you have in poor countries a great deal more homicide. And it's very interesting to read the best data which Durkheim has published, for instance, in his study on suicide, which is still a classic study, to see how in Germany, during the 19th century, in the second part of the 19th century, with increasing industrialization, suicide rates increase. My own interpretation of it is really that in the cash society, life itself becomes a business. And if you fail in your business, then indeed you might as well kill yourself. That life becomes a function of success, of economic success, and economic failure is a basis for suicide. Naturally, you don't have this perverted scheme in poor countries. In poor countries, you have an entirely different phenomenon, and that is less control, more alcoholism, and all sorts of factors which lead to more homicide. Actually, what I found is when I added both homicide and suicide as destructive acts together, then that you found that they range for the Western countries from a maximum of 35 per 100,000 destructive acts in Denmark and 24 in the United States to 4% to 4 by 100,000 in Ireland, and very little also in in Italy. In other words, here you also do not find at all that the number of homicides is balanced by the number of suicides, but you find that if you combine the two, there are still tremendous differences in destructiveness per se, and you have to find out what is the answer to this rather than to that you can complain it on the basis of the drive, the destructive drive, which either leads to homicide or leads to suicide. It just isn't so. Well, if we speak then about individual differences, I think that any observer of men, whether he is a psychiatrist or whether he is a layman, and some laymen are better observers sometimes than psychiatrists, knows very well when he sees a destructive, vicious, hostile person and when he sees a person who is good-natured and undestructive. Now, if you stick to the Freudian theory, then of course you say, yes, but unconsciously, this man who is so, who looks so nice and so well-meaning and all that, unconsciously imagine the amount of destructiveness he has. Well, it isn't so. And let me give you a very simple example. Assuming a man comes to a psychiatrist today and says, Doctor, I hate my wife, I hate my children, I hate everybody, I wish they were all dead. Well, the psychiatrist wouldn't say, oh, well, that's a matter of taste, a matter of values. The psychiatrist would see immediately that this man is either severely sick, perhaps psychotic, or that all this may not be genuine, that he's just talking that way, and he may see in his eyes a very gentle, sweet expression which belies the whole talk. And then he will treat him, will find out that after a while it turns out that this man has hardened his heart at some point, got very angry against the whole world, but that he doesn't really mean what he says, or doesn't even mean what he feels. All that has happened with him is he has hardened his heart. But if the psychiatrist sees that expression in his face of uncompromising hostility and destructiveness, and if that is so generalized that hardly anybody is left or nobody is left, then he knows this man is very sick. Now here you have the peculiar thing that while in general or many psychiatrists claim that value judgments should not enter into psychiatric judgments, here the value judgment and psychiatric judgment are identical. A person who is so full of hate is a sick person, because man is not born to be so full of hate. Man is born to live, with the exception of perhaps some constitutionally sick people, just as you have congenital morons or congenital idiots. But that is not the average man. That are great exceptions which have their very special reasons. In fact, you see, you find that just as you find a very vicious, destructive person, you recognize the sadist. You recognize a person who has a pleasure, who is not just destructive, but who has a pleasure in suffering, who has a pleasure in complete control over another person. Whether he's a bureaucrat behind the window who just enjoys the fact that people have to wait and then they don't get anything. Or whether he's a man who can find sexual enjoyment only by inflicting pain upon a woman. It is all the same. There is a pleasure in what I would call absolute control. I shall talk about that more later in these lectures. But you see it. You see the mouth. You see the smile. You see the something. If you observe it all, you see the sometimes hidden and sometimes not so hidden pleasure. You watch some pictures of police beating up people. Now, sometimes you see there is a facial expression which is not sadistic. They are just doing their duty. But sometimes you will see a man with an elated, almost ecstatic face, facial expression of sadism in the moment of violence. In other words, and it is not at all so that the very same people who have an enjoyment of life, who love people, who enjoy the growth and aliveness of people, that these people hate themselves. This is just plain nonsense. And every psychiatric and psychological observation shows it. I wished you wouldn't read so many books and wouldn't go to these lectures, including mine. And instead of that, you would begin to observe. There is so much to see. We have now, for instance, a wonderful instrument, television, which in general only offers the worst things, but sometimes it does offer something good, and that is, it permits one to see rather nakedly a person's face and his facial impression. Now, I would think as long as people are manipulated by words, they are rather lost, because people are naive and believe, well, they know the words are untrue, just as they know that the toothpastes, various kinds of toothpaste, are all the same, and yet they are impressed by it. But if you watch a face, and if you really know that you can see a lot about the man in his face, in his gesture, in his voice, in his hands, in his posture, in many things, then indeed you don't need so many specialists. And our democracy would work a great deal better if the voters saw the faces of the men for whom they vote, rather than to listen to their words. This is a matter of practice and training, and everybody has access to it. There's no secret. But we are so accustomed to take words for an ultimate expression of what is real that we have become awfully stupid. We have become more gullible than children. And in fact, as I shall try to show later, the problem of aggressiveness is to a large extent in the world a problem of gullibility rather than of a destructive instinct. But that I shall try to make a little bit clearer as these lectures go on. Now then, this would lead to the conclusion that man is really not destructive because of the innate destructive instinct. He is not destructive because the genetic factor of the inheritance of animal destructiveness. For all these reasons, he is not destructive. In fact, if he were only as destructive, as I said before, as the animals, everything would be just fine. But the fact is, as some observers have noted, that man is much more destructive than animals are. That hardly any animal species equals man in viciousness, aggressiveness, destructiveness. And we have the problem, the paradoxical problem, not the problem as Lawrence puts it or Freud puts it, to explain man's destructiveness on the basis of certain innate instincts, but to explain man's destructiveness, which is greater than that of other animals, by the very specific conditions of human existence. Man's destructiveness is a product of our human qualities. And were it not for our human qualities, this destructiveness would at least not be greater than that of the primates. Now, what human qualities am I talking about here? There's nothing mysterious about it. Awareness, imagination, the capacity for loneliness, the capacity for boredom, and the sense of impotence. All these are qualities which are specifically human. And the thesis I shall trying to follow up here is the thesis that indeed human aggressiveness can be understood only by an examination of what these specific human qualities, which are the very best we have, can create under circumstances in which they lead to the very worst in us. And I can already say at this point that I think these instinctive theories, like that of Freud or of Lawrence and a few others, only serve to obscure the real questions. As long as we think we explain war, we explain violence, we explain hate by the assumption of a hate and aggressive instinct, we don't look for the real psychological and for the real economic and social and cultural problems which produce this kind of destructiveness. And it's very interesting that these books again have become very popular. There's a book of Lawrence, for instance, and some others. People are freed from the obligation to come to grips with the question of destructiveness as long as they can believe that it's just man's nature. I read recently about the legend in one tribe in South America, I forgot which one it was, who have the legend that man was made from the blood which flew from one god in the sky, and this blood, for them blood is destructive and aggressive, and because man is made of this blood, man has an aggressive nature. And then they had to explain, but why are some people like cowards and women who are not aggressive? And they said, well, they are just not made of that blood, they are made of something else. Well, that is a legend of a primitive tribe. I don't think it is a bit worse than the more sophisticated assumption that man is so destructive because he has a destructive instinct. It's essentially the same model of explaining something by hypothesizing an instinct for it, and therefore not to see what are the realities, what are the real psychological problems which we have to look for. And there are plenty. Now, next time I shall begin with what then is the program for the rest of these lectures, namely to discuss various types of qualitatively different types of aggression or destructiveness. I might indicate at this point before I stop what they are, namely aggression or destructiveness or destruction without destructive motive, as destructive acts without destructive motivations. Second, defensive destructiveness. Third, sadistic destructiveness. And eventually necrophilous destructiveness. But this means relatively little to you right now. I shall try to develop the idea, the description, what is meant by these various kinds of destructiveness, and that each of them, being qualitatively different, has entirely different motivations. And that only if we understand their distinctness can we understand the motivation for each. As I said before, I believe, as long as we believe that there is a generalized thing, aggressiveness of destructiveness, we can never find the reason, because there cannot be one reason for phenomena which are quite distinct. And therefore, the search for the causes of destructiveness is quite futile. Thank you. We have now a little usual intermission and then some time for questions. I made this suggestion to have a little bit more light here because somebody wrote me in a note that apropos of my observation about seeing people, it is not fair that I should be seen only by the people who sit here and not by the people in the audience. Now, I think that's perfectly fair. I wasn't aware that I am not visible for the people in the audience, but I want to explain to you that if I cannot see the audience, it's very difficult for me to talk. So I hope we can, with this lighting, you can see me? All right. Now, there are a few questions. That is to say, quite a few, but I can only answer a few. Here's a following question. Marx once said that we are still in a state of pre-existence. Are we to understand that aggression or destruction belongs to the pre-existence, and if we should enter existence, human existence, aggression would not be present? Well, I have to correct the statement a little bit. Marx did not speak of pre-existence, but of prehistory. He said all human history so far is prehistory, and human history will begin only with when human freedom is fully established, or you might say when man ceases to be like the animal who has to spend most of his time seeking for food. Or you might say, and Marx does not say that, but it is he did not the works of Professor Skinner, and probably might not even have guessed that this would be the fashion in the United States as well as in the Soviet Union, although they are not under the name of Professor Skinner, but under slightly different headache. I'm sorry, I said headaches. That was a slip of the tongue. I meant headings, of course. But it is quite a headache. What I was going to say was one could express the same thing in the following way. So far, the history of man is a history of a domesticated animal. Man controlled his instincts, his drives to a large extent by the process of conditioning. And before one knew about Professor Skinner and Pavlov, it was very well known. If you frighten a person enough, he will eventually learn the signals and act according to what is called reinforcements in one way or another, and if you give certain rewards, he will act accordingly. Man's behavior to a large extent has been determined by punishment and reward, that is to say, by methods of conditioning. And you might as well consider the fact that the large new brain which man has absolutely nothing to do with the control by conditioning, because you can do that with rats, with cats, with animals whose brain is not comparable to that of man, and man's brain is not even comparable with that of the primates. You don't need much of a brain, of a new brain, in order to control your actions as much as they are simply determined by sheer instinctive responses. You might raise a question that the time has not yet begun where man makes really full use of his brain. And that does not mean of his thinking only. It means of all the new dimensions which are specifically human. We are still thinking about man mechanistically in terms of here are these instincts and they are controlled, but we know that man has qualities and faculties which transcend far that which you find in the animal. His sense of beauty, his sense of tenderness, his sense of joy, his way of listening to music, his sense of relating himself to other people. One cannot even begin to talk about all those human faculties which are specifically human, which have to do with awareness, with imagination, with the concept of self, which are indeed human and which you don't find in the animal. Now, if Professor Lawrence speaks about the fact that certain acts of the grey-lag geese have the analogy in the behavior between the Russian and the American government, then I think this is plain nonsense. Because this is an analogizing between a certain type of animal behavior and a highly complex behavior of statesmen, which Dr. Lawrence doesn't even begin to understand. I mean, the animal behavior he may, but not the human behavior. In other words, what we can call here, if we refer to Marx as prehistory, it is that stage of human development where man as man comes into his own and where he begins to transcend with a new human reaction the old set of animal reactions which are relatively determined, relatively set, although the higher up you go in the animal kingdom, the less so. Man hasn't even begun yet to make use of it, and maybe he couldn't have. Because indeed, in a world in which there was never enough to eat for all, necessarily man was split between those who gave commands and got the rewards and those who had to work and could not share, could not sit on the table because there wasn't enough for all. Now, that is unfortunately still the situation if we look at the world as a whole. In fact, it is a situation, it's a gap which becomes greater rather than smaller, as all of you are interested in the problem know, that the distance, the difference between the poor nations and the rich nations, in spite of all increasing productivity of industry in the West, is becoming larger. That we are actually, according to some experts, and very serious one, threatened already with large-scale famines in about 10 years because we avoid even thinking and making plans which would lead to a common life of all nations on this world. Now, what effects that will have on the history of man, on the development of man, or whether that might not simply end in the radical solution of nuclear war, in which will take care of the population explosion and will take care of almost everything in the most nihilistic sense, is another question. Marx was not thinking of this. And this is the tragic situation of the moment, that indeed we have in principle the means for a new period of human life, not only in America, but in the long run in the whole world, if we make use of what we know and if we make intelligent use, rather than to live day by day and use violence whenever we cannot manage what we should be able to manage. Here's a question. Animals have their enemies in other species. Perhaps in man the place of species is taken by the group, the nation, the class, or the caste, and these may become enemies. Well, that is indeed a very interesting idea, which has been sometimes discussed in the literature, whether we can really speak in the same sense of the experience of species in man as the animal talks, and the animal experiences as a member of the same species. Of course, if one starts out on a purely biological basis, and we are one species. But actually, I don't think that the main reason for the hostility between various groups and classes is based on something which could be compared or is analogous to the hostility in animals among the species, because even there the hostility is not so particularly great. I shall try in the course of these lectures to answer this question more fully. That is to say, why, in my opinion, you have so much hostility between certain groups and less among others, and what are the real sources of human destructiveness, rather than to explain them by an extension of an innate destructiveness only against another group instead of another species. Here's a question, and this is not the only one. Why did you decide to leave out Lawrence after you had scheduled it? Well, I did say last time why I left it out. I do not have any sinister motive to leave it out. On the contrary, it is quite, in a way, a sacrifice which I bring you. I have written 70 pages in a book manuscript on this topic about Lawrence. It would be much easier for me to talk an hour about Lawrence because I have it all written down. I left it out because, as I explained before, I thought it was more valuable to spend an hour more time, as I did on Freud, than on Lawrence, because Freud's theory is so much more profound, so much more interesting, that I think with a limited amount of time, I offer you something more interesting than talking about Lawrence, which is really basically not very interesting, partly very superficial, and hardly gives any occasion for serious discussion, except showing how nonsensical most of his conclusions are and most of his analogies are between animals and human beings. So for those, I have to apologize, and I did apologize last time, for those who have expected this 1 hour about Lawrence, have come here for this reason, and wanted specifically to hear about Lawrence. I am sorry to have disappointed them, but I did so because I felt an hour more about Freud was, for most of you, more valuable. If we could vote about it, then majority of you might vote that it isn't so, and then, of course, you might be right, although not necessarily. The layman hears of and believes in the instinct of self-preservation. As an example, I jump aside when an auto careens towards me. But how common in daily life is an instinct for self-destruction? Well, indeed, I don't think that is in itself very common, as I shall try to show. You do find attitudes of self-destruction which, as I shall try to say, have mostly an irrational and pathological content. The normal thing is, in man and animal, that he tries to save his life, either by flight or by attack. Therefore, jumping away from a car is following the laws of nature, while offering oneself to be run over would require a good deal of explanation beyond that of the assumption that the destructive instinct has been turned inwards, which really says nothing. When you say we must look upon acts of violence in a cynical, unsentimental, realistical fashion, are you suggesting that we ought to formulate better means of punishment or better means of cure? Or are only some forms of violence curable? Well, I'm very glad that somebody asked this question, because indeed I'm afraid that I might not have been understood by everybody rightly in what I meant to convey, especially since I was talking very briefly about a very complicated subject. First, I was not speaking in favor of more punishment. I think punishment is in the realm of conditioning. It does not change anything. It's born out of a feeling of hate, and only under very special circumstances Might you want to isolate a person to prevent that he does more harm? But certainly, under no circumstances would I be in favor of killing or punishing by death anybody, regardless of the crime he has committed. So I'm not asking for more better punishment. What I meant by a realistic understanding is something quite different. It is simply to understand the reality of what goes on in the act of destructiveness here. That means understanding the whole situation. What could be the political, psychological motivations of the assassin? What could he have been influenced? What is the chance of actions which go in that, which repeat the same act toward other people, against other people? It would imply the question, how can the citizens of the United States and the citizens of the world, what can they do to change a situation which threatens to deteriorate into violence, but not by preaching and not by sentimental words, but by attitudes and actions which are convincing? A little bit of an example of this has been given by Mayor Lindsay here. I found this quite impressive because it was an unbureaucratic, human, courageous way of dealing with a human situation. But that is only a small part of the whole problem. It means to see where are we going. It means to see, for instance, why are men who represent the best in men, why are they assassinated? Is there something in a large group of men who cannot tolerate the presence of decency and of faith and of courage? Because if these men live, they are shown up as enemies of life. And hence, they must hate the men who present that which they cannot fulfill in themselves. One has to look into the political implications in every sense. Such a murder is a very complex affair. It's not just a lunatic who commits an act, even if he would turn out to be a lunatic. It's not just a lunatic, as I tried to say before. You can understand everybody, but then to say, well, he is only sick, this is only pathological, and hence the evil is not quite real, that is something quite different from not hating, from understanding a profoundly human sense, and yet being very aware of the whole reality which goes on. Now, I don't think I can do a much better job in 5 minutes more to explain what I mean about this. I would ask you to try it out, provided you are interested, in really thinking a great deal about what all the ramifications of such a murder are, of its consequences, of its causes, of the possibilities of reacting to it, and to distinguish this from the personal attitude toward the murderer, to distinguish this from a vengefulness or hate against the murderer, which is an entirely different story. Now, before I stop, I just want to say one word. I used the word cynical awareness of reality. I'm aware that this might be misunderstood. I hope it would be understood. The point is, I use a very strong word in order to indicate as strongly as I can that our realism must be so free from all sentimentality, from all fuzziness, that it might appear cynical to those who believe that the Reader's Digest is the ultimate of reality. And I would prefer to be cynical in this sense than to be sentimental. I'm not really cynical, and I don't wish you to be cynical. But I believe that what we need for the very hard times we are passing through and which we shall pass through is that combination which is not so much in our tradition, namely of deep faith, of deep love, and at the same time of an utterly hard-headed, realistic awareness of all the facts. Thank you.